This
Hmm.
was a peaceful revolution. It did not have a grudge, a kind of a vengeance against the ruling elite, but it was actually much more of an inclusive movement. It meant to include rather than exclude. Again, very much contrary to the 1979 revolution and its aftermath. When the constitution came about, for reasons entirely independent from the constitution, the British and the Russians came to an agreement that is referred to as the 1907 agreement of dividing Iran into two zones of influence. They never called it any kind of occupation or during the Pahlavi era, from the very beginning, they were even further isolated. So the story of the clerical establishment in Iran from the 1920s up to 1970s is isolation. That is, they were forced back into the madrasa. So what happened to them? That the mullahs that were always very conservative, that always pro-establishment, that there was always pro-monarchy, they turned into a revolutionary force that was against the monarchy. That was
Welcome to Scholars Unravel the Middle East. I'm Adel Ali, your host. I was born in the Middle East, but grew up in America, and I have a message for Middle Eastern Americans. Don't learn about the Middle East from US news media or Hollywood, and don't buy into the Western view of world history. That's why I talk to scholars, 150 and counting, scholars who have spent decades studying the Middle East, the scholars who make it easy for all of us to understand, because in this program, they distill their extensive research and rich stories into an hour of engaging conversation with me. And my goal for this program is to correct our misperceptions and misconceptions about the Middle East, this fascinating region with its long and remarkable history. Dr. Amanat, it's a pleasure to have you on our program again. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. The years 1905 to 1911, that period was quite transformative for Iran, and this is the period referred to as the Constitutional Revolution. Before we get into it, for our audience members who are not familiar with Iran's history necessarily, how big of a deal was the Constitutional Revolution in the context of the bigger Middle East history?
good. Well, let me start by saying briefly that since the prime concern of us is, as the title of your program announces, is the history behind the news.
Uh-huh.
Well, the news is what's happening today, unfortunately, very tragic events that is happening in Iran, or past 12 days, that there was an assault, really, on Iran, and for which the people of Iran are paying. So, how does that correspond to a century and a quarter ago? That is the constitutional revolution at the turn of the 20th century.
Wow, what we mean, like what does the current crisis in Iran, Israel, US relate back to a
Yes,
century and a half ago? Oh,
yes,
wow, this is
yes, that's
intriguing.
what it is.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, that's one thing. And then the second caveat, which I thought it would be important to bring into in mind, Iran is that's one of the points that you raised. Iran is probably one of the very few countries in the world, perhaps with the exception of China, that experienced two revolutions in the course of the 20th century. As a matter of fact, I can argue two and a half revolution.
Two and a half
Half,
revolutions.
the half revolution is the events of the 1950s, early 1950s.
Oh, you mean the
That was,
Mossadegh era, the prime
that's right,
minister and the
that
Shah?
era.
Okay.
That is between 1941 and 1953. That's a period which in the book that you refer to, the Iran book of mine, I refer to as the chaotic democracy,
Yes.
period of the chaotic democracy. And there
And by the
again,
by that book, you mean Iran and Modern History, which
Iran
is
and modern
sitting right
history.
behind me on this bookshelf.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for displaying it.
Sure.
Um, yes. So, in effect, Iran, whether experienced or suffered or benefited from two and a half revolutions,
Two and a
rather
half
than,
revolutions in 1 century.
yes, in 1 century. And I suppose that makes it even more pertinent to talk about what happened. Of course, it's too much to cover in one interview,
Yeah.
but since we're going back to the Constitutional Revolution, let us start there. This is the starting point, perhaps. Of
Hmm.
course, if you had asked a historian, they would all, I'm sure you're really familiar, they would immediately tell you, well, there has been a precedence, there has been a background, look
Yeah.
back in the 19th century. And this is true in the case. Because if you look it back, I just make a quick reference. If you look back at 19th century history of Iran, you would see that at least two events. One, the Babi movement
Hmm.
in the middle of the century was really a revolution.
Which was an
And then,
endogenous religious movement.
yes, right, that
Yes, yes.
eventually led to what it's today, the Baha'i faith. And then the second thing is the Regime uprising in the 1891 to 1896, which is usually referred to as a prelude or a rehearsal for the constitutional revolution. That's just a brief point. As far as the actual constitutional revolution in Iran is concerned, there are several issues of significance about it. First one is that in the Middle East is the first in the Middle East, and the first and the only popular one. Popular by which I mean it was not a military coup as it happened in 1908 in the Ottoman Empire with the CUP, the Committee for Union and Progress, and eventually the Young Turks, which was the outcome of it. It was a revolution with uh, tens of thousands of people in the streets, and therefore that's a very different phenomenon.
That sounds like it was more bottom up than top down.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
It was
Okay.
bottom up. To some extent, it was top down as well. I would explain that. It was
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
both process. Second is that if you compare it actually with the broader picture, it was before the constitutional revolution in China and the constitutional revolution in Japan, both of them in 1911. So
Hmm.
Iran had a kind of a precedence. Whether this is something to be proud of or not, I don't know. But it depends on how you would look at it. Second point is that uh, the only other revolution which coincides with the middle revolution in Iran is the 1905 revolution in Russia,
Yeah.
which had a pertinence, a significance, relevance to the revolution in Iran, because as a matter of fact, Iranians were always afraid of Russia,
Hmm.
Tsarist Russia, and later, of course,
The
the
Soviet Union.
Soviet Union.
Mhm.
And I presume even today, um, you would see that when they saw that there is a popular movement in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, in Russia, then I think it encouraged some of the Iranian intellectuals to also think about the possibility that there might be a revolution also in Iran. Why they thought so? Because if you look a few years later, in 1909 to 1911, 1912, you see the presence of Tsarist Russia suppressing the Iranian Revolution
Yeah.
and basically bringing it to an end, along with the British, of course.
Yeah.
But in effect, you see that the concerns and the hopes of the Iranian revolutionaries that if there is a constitutional movement in Russia, perhaps they could have a constitutional revolution of their own.
Why not
And
us? Yeah.
that did not reduce by any means the authenticity, in my opinion, and uh, the nature, the characteristic of the Iranian Revolution. the constitutional revolution in Iran, which remained very much a Persian one.
Yeah.
Contrary to what is usually been said, that they took the constitution from the French constitution or Belgian
Yeah. Yeah.
constitution or
Yeah.
Bulgarian constitution,
Yeah.
that that is maybe true. They looked to see where else what is available. But the nature of that revolution was very Iranian, and I would explain to you how and why. For one thing, as I've said in many other occasions, in contrast to the revolution of 1979 at the end of the century,
Yeah.
the constitutional revolution in 1906, 1905, 1906 to 1912, and they extended, by the way, in terms of periodization, to 1921. I think it's somewhat superficial to consider it as an end by 1911. It took another 10 years through this First World War up to the rise of Reza Khan in 1921
A new
that you
dynasty.
see, but yeah, that you see in effect the the constitutional revolution resonates for another 10 years. It does
Hmm.
not stop. No revolutionary movement or popular movement can stop at a certain, and people go back home and say, okay, we forget about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That never happens.
It doesn't halt immediately. Yeah.
No. So my periodization, as indeed I mentioned my Iran book, is rather broader. The second one is that time and again I refer to it as an innocent revolution. And some people actually question me why you are calling it innocent. I call it innocent compared to the 1979 revolution.
I
For
noted
the
that in your
fact,
book. Yeah. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
for one thing, because it was not a violent one. I mean, although much violence did occur in the course of the revolution, there was a
Yeah.
civil
Yeah.
war. In between 1908, 1909, there was a civil war. Afterwards, there was much up until the very end of the period, 1921, there was much of violence, much of contention, but it was not part and parcel of the revolution itself. This
Hmm.
was a peaceful revolution. It did not have a grudge, a kind of a vengeance against the ruling elite, but it was actually much more of an inclusive movement. It meant to include rather than exclude. Again, very much contrary to the 1979 revolution and its aftermath, because perhaps you can say that the 1979 revolution was a very broad-based revolution and inclusive, but it turned quickly into an exclusive revolution with an exclusive ideology. We'll come back to it in a moment. The next point is that you asked this question in a set of your questions. You asked whether this was a revolution with the leadership,
Mm-hmm,
or
mm-hmm.
was this a kind of a dispersed leadership?
Yeah.
Obviously, the latter. And I think one of the great things about it, one of the advantages of the Constitutional Revolution, that it did not have a charismatic leader, such as usually Ayatollah Khomeini is defined as a charismatic leader in 1979 revolution. In this case, all through the Constitutional Revolution, you cannot find a single leader as charismatic or as kind of a ultimate leader. Was one of several or one of
Yeah.
many.
Yeah.
I cannot name any. Perhaps the most significant is Hassan Taqizadeh, who can be considered as kind of a leader of the constitutional revolution. But by no means he had a ultimate power or ultimate superiority over the others, but was one of many. As a matter of fact, even in the earlier days of the revolution, he did not play much of a role. It's
Why
later
do
on.
you, Dr. Amanat, why do you say this dispersed leadership of the constitutional revolution as opposed to centralized leadership of the 1979 revolution? Why do you say this dispersed leadership is an advantage? Was an
Yes,
advantage?
because it canceled some of the militancy within the movement itself. There were
Ah,
several groups, they canceled each other out. And if you look at its composition, you would see that there are primarily, actually, as a matter of fact, the merchants in the bazaars in the major cities, such as your ancestors
a
that you have just
breeze.
mentioned to me
Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah,
Tabriz,
yeah, yeah.
merchants in Tabriz,
Northwest Iran.
or members of the guilds, asnaf, which always played a very important part in the bazaar and were led by the merchants. Merchants were considered as the kind of an upper echelon of the guilds in the bazaar. That is refers to the shoemakers, clothiers, soap makers. I'm just remembering a few that took part in the Constitutional Revolution. If you look at the composition, these were the main parties that played a part in the movement. And for very good reason, because their lives were affected economically by the international, by the global trends in the course of the early 20th century. As a matter of fact, 19th century and early 20th century.
Yeah, yeah. I want to make one comment. Having read your book, the soap makers and
Yes,
carpet weavers and all that, the examples that
yes,
you just enumerated. What was interesting for me, Doctor Amanat, was that they weren't just the riffraff, the sort of the people that were on the streets. They actually go and they participate in
yes.
sort of organizing and the. I don't remember if they were all in the parliament, the Majlis, but they were actually participating in the organizing and everything.
Actually,
Yeah, they were not
yes,
marginalized.
yes, yes. As a matter of fact, in that famous protest uh, um, uh, period that the constitutionalists were allowed to come to the sanctuary of the
British,
British
yeah,
legation in
yes,
Tehran, which was everybody would say it's why they should go to the British legation, well, for very obvious reasons that that was the sanctuary that would have kept them away from the harm of the state that could have controlled
yeah,
could have attacked them. So it was, and the merchants who basically invited this population to come in. If you look at, there are certain postcards in which you can see there are gatherings or there are particular tents for every uh, guild that took part in the movement. They were they were simple people. They
yeah.
didn't know, and this is another criticism usually from the modernists or that they would say positivists, that they would say, what did they know about the Constitution? Constitution is for Montesquieu, or
Montesquieu.
no, it's not for these people. And they actually, if you read some of the proceedings of the first Majlis, which is available, published, when you read the proceedings of the first parliament, Iranian parliament, you see that all these representatives of the guilds, very simple people, merchants, again, very simple people, take part. And in the course of the conversation, they say things, they ask questions. That is perfect. That is what matters, not a very sophisticated mind who would be able to frame what the Constitution is all about. But the Constitutional Revolution had other components. It had a Western educated or Darul Funun educated, Darul
These are the
Funun being
intellectuals.
the intellectual. Generally, you can refer them as intellectuals.
Mhm.
These people had a much greater, much more focused view of what we would consider as a democratic constitutional regime. That is a popular representation, a plural system of a group of representatives who come together and then frame a constitution, which is precisely what happened in the course of the first Majlis. Again, people think that this is just adopted from a European model. If you read the proceedings, you see every item people raise questions. Every article of the Constitution, as a matter of fact, I think Taqizadeh points that out in his reflections on the Constitutional Revolution. He points out that on every little detail, people would raise questions.
By
And
people, you
nothing
mean the quote unquote simpler people, such as your
yes,
soap maker, carpet weavers.
yes.
They were
And it was,
asking discerning
yes,
questions.
yeah, they would asking, what is the meaning of the division of power between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary? What does that mean? How does it affect our lives? So there were people who were very genuinely asking questions, and more so, if you look at some of the pictures of the Constitutional Revolution, always around the Majlis, that is the parliament, you would see a crowd. The crowd was eager. There was no public, what do you call it, public
Rally or something?
public
Announcement, yeah.
announcement system.
Yeah,
So they
yeah, like a
had to
PA
listen.
system. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So they had to listen and relate to the people behind what is going on. So there was a much greater participation by ordinary people who were coming every day to see what is happening. And they thought they had this unrealistic hopes that overnight things are going to improve, that their economic downturn is going to eventually lead to a better life. So there was some displaced great hopes for the future that did never happen.
That had
Of
never
course,
happened.
happened only, it would never happen in any revolution, let alone in the constitutional revolution.
I have two follow-up questions to ask you
Sure.
on two important things, important in my view, that you shared with us. As you were explaining to us what you mean by labeling the constitutional revolution in Iran, 1905 to 1911, as innocent as opposed to the 1979 revolution. One of the things you said, you used this phrase, Dr. Amanat. You said it was an inclusive movement. So let me
Mhm.
let me put us in 2025 as U.S. and Israel have engaged in a very brief war with Iran, and we're not going to get into politics. That's not the point. The term regime change has been bandied about. You see it on all news, Fox News, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times. So let me go back to this. When you say that the constitutional revolution was an inclusive movement, was regime change back then
Well,
a,
not
a
necessarily.
goal? Was it a goal or no?
No, it was not.
Huh.
It was not. The institution of monarchy in Iran in the
Uh,
past has always been so well established for thousands of years
of course.
that people could not even conceive that there would be a kind of a republican regime in
Yeah.
which there would be no monarchy. Perhaps minority had that kind of an idea, and that, as a matter of fact, quickly was suppressed or left
Set
out.
aside.
Yes, set aside. Well, people thought, okay, yeah, we have a great king called Muzaffar Shah. That was the last year of his rule.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
was weak, he was ill, he died. Um, He's a great king. He gave us what they would refer to as Adl Muzaffar, the Muzaffari justice,
Hmm.
Adl justice, which is
Yeah.
the idea behind the whole concept of why you want to have a constitutional revolution. For Iranians, Shia Iranians, the concept of justice, Adl, is a very significant one because it was one of the foundation usul, the principles of Shiism. You see, there are five. If you would go to an Iranian school, they would tell you
Yeah.
it's the unity of God, Tawheed. It's the nubuwwat or the prophethood of Muhammad.
Hmm.
The third one is the question of Ma'ad, is the resurrection and at the end of the time. The fourth one is justice, adl. And the fifth one is imamat, the continuity of the line of the Prophet through Ali and his descendants.
This is the
Okay,
12th Imam that is
these are,
hidden.
yes, yes, that was considered. So what they meant by adl is that precisely that idea that we want a society that give us a better time,
So
that
they
we
weren't looking for, obviously, not a Republican form of government, and they weren't at that point, as you're saying, as you're sharing with me, they weren't looking to topple the Qajar dynasty and come up with a whole
not
new line.
yet,
Not
but
yet.
in the process, when the successor, his son, Muhammad Ali Mirza, became Muhammad Ali Shah, from the first day, Muhammad Ali Shah felt that the constitutionalists are a threat, and he was reinforced in his perception by the by Russia. Russia played a part directly or indirectly
Imperial
in the
Russia.
way
Yeah.
that a movement, a counter-constitutionalist movement, gradually emerged in the court. Royalists thought that constitutionalists are limiting their power, removing them from the control of the entire system, and as such, these are threats to the future, to the very existence of monarchy, to the very existence of the established regime.
I see.
Remember, the word in Persian for constitutionalism is mashrute, as you have heard.
Yes.
Mashrute from the word shart in Arabic Persian, meaning limit, meaning
Or
condition.
condition, as you describe in your book.
Yes,
Yes.
condition.
Yeah.
So this was basically a movement was conditionalism, basically conditioning the monarchy into a certain restraints, into a certain order.
That's
So
such a clear
creating
description. So you're looking for reforming the existing system, not
precisely.
a revolution in as far as like a major
Mm.
upheaval.
Yeah, they were not for a major upheaval. They didn't see a benefit in major upheaval. What they wanted to was a
Oh,
better social and economic condition. As I said, they had high hopes that this is going to come around. And they thought that this would come through a democratic process, a rule of law, and more important, actually, if again you look at the proceedings of the first and the second Majlis, you would see that the major concern of the constitutionalists, those who are sitting in the parliament or in the newspapers of the time, there was, by the way, and a kind of an explosion of the press. There are
yeah, yeah, yeah.
numerous newspapers coming out. So you can see that they all, in addition to the rule of law, is the desire for improvement of their lives through material development,
Yeah.
material question of better financing, better taxation, better centralized power, better education, more than important than anything, public education,
Yeah.
modern public education, which was seen by the constitution as a key to the better future, and
Yeah.
rightly so. They
Yeah.
said
And rightly
madrasa
so.
education cannot provide us with the kind of expertise by which we would be able to compete with Europe or to learn from Europe.
A madrasa, which I have no familiarity with. This is decades and decades before my time when I was a child in Iran, but they were religious based schools.
Yes, exactly. They
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
like seminaries, as you
Seminaries.
would find in the Christian context.
Yeah.
These are these are seminarians who, for many years, 7 years or more, spend their time studying these arcane texts from medieval times
Oh,
in 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 uh, the jurisprudence and the legal system that had absolutely no relevance to the reality of the time, or the society that they were facing.
And they
So
were
the
probably,
constitutionalists basically saying, okay, we need modern education to learn languages, to learn skills, to be able to build a new society, to build a
yeah,
new economy. So that's basically what they wanted. Now, let me also point this out. What the constitutionalists had been contemplating ultimately materialized in early Pahlavi period. That's from 1921 onwards,
so
with
the
the rise of
in the
the,
next
the
dynasty.
yes,
Um,
because if you look at the program of reform of early Reza Shah era, that is between 1921 and perhaps 1930s or even 1941, the period of the first Pahlavi rule, you would see that whatever they did basically is what the constitutionalists were talking about or trying to implement. They
yeah,
wanted this more centralized system. They wanted a unified army. They wanted the greater incorporation of the entire country into a system, a centralized system for whatever it was, good or worse. That's what they wanted. A better financing, creation of banks, new Iranian currency, more than anything else, modern education
yeah.
and modern communication, roads, railroad. These are all aspirations of the constitutionalists.
And Reza
So in a
Shah
sense, there is a
materialized that.
continuity with
Yeah.
the early Pahlavi period. When people would say constitutional revolution failed, yes, maybe the the exercise of democracy was failed, and for reasons that I would explain in a moment. But in terms of material culture, in terms of material progress, basically what they conceived is what emerged in the Reza Khan and Reza Shah period.
Dr. Amanat, let me go back to revolution, the term revolution. One, based on what you've explained to me and our audience so far, this is not a setup for the 1789 French Revolution. This is more like the sort of thing that, let's say, Edmund Burke, the British parliamentarian, had in mind,
Yes.
reforming
Well,
more
that's
than
a
anything.
great,
Yeah.
yes, that's a
So
great, actually, that's a great
comparison.
a comparison, that parallel that you
Yeah,
brought up. Because, as you know, the French Revolution was a very violent revolution.
exactly. Yeah.
Guillotine, I mean, the very idea of a guillotine shows that violence, embodies that violence.
Yes, yes.
The Constitutional Revolution never had that. There is, at the end of the Civil War that was fought in 1909,
Yeah.
uh, the number of people who were executed as a result of the victory of the constitutionalists over the royalists perhaps was
Huh.
5 or 6. One of them was Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, this great jurist and the now a darling of the constitutional of the
Of the
revolution
Islamic
of
regime. Every
1970. Yes,
yeah,
of the
they
Islamic
have a
regime.
street named after him. I looked it up, and I want to ask you about that later.
Yeah, it's
But
a highway named after him.
the
Yeah.
highway name of him. I want to. The reason I mentioned that I said I want to go back to the term revolution is this. As I was reading your book on page 342 of your book, I stumbled on something really interesting. And I'm paraphrasing. I don't have it in front of me. I'm speaking out of memory, Dr. Amanat. You said something to the effect that before the constitutional revolution, the word revolution in Farsi was more like seasonal changes and related to health related issues and maladies.
Yes.
But it was, uh, am I correct to say that the constitutional revolutions changed the meaning of the word
Yes.
revolution in Farsi? So at
Yes,
some
very
point
true.
it became something
Yeah.
bigger. So yeah, talk about
Yes.
that, please.
Yes, that's very true. If you read some of the 19th century accounts, even chronicles, you would
Mhm.
see that this انقلاب جوی means climatic revolution, meaning
Hmm.
if there was a storm or Iran never had a hurricane, but if there was a storm or something,
Yeah.
they would refer to it as this kind of a climatic revolution. And revolution, of course, corresponds to the zodiac. because it's the movements of the zodiac
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that creates this revolving idea. This is the idea that the the universe revolves. This is a concept you would find in Persian poetry a great deal. Gumbad Dawar, as it's a reference to the revolving dome in
Yeah,
poetry
yeah.
of Hafez. You would find a lot of it. So that concept in the Constitutional Revolution, they were looking for words for the what was going on, and well, it was first referred to as nehzat. Nehzat in Arabic Persian means movement, okay? Constitutional movement. Even more conservative historians of the Constitutional Revolution up to 1960s, including Miss Anne Lambton, Professor Anne Lambton,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote an account about the Constitutional Revolution, refers to it as a movement. She doesn't like the idea of a revolution. So she says a movement. This was a movement. It was not a
Yeah.
revolution. The revolutionaries, in the course of the revolution, particularly during the period of the Civil War, when there was a resistance against the royalist coup that happened in 1908, bombarded the parliament, dispersed and executed some of the revolutionaries, some of the constitutionalists. This, in places like Tabriz, became a resistance movement later on in Rasht, later in the Caspian, later on in Esfahan in central Iran. There were forces that fought against against the royalists, and the royalists attempt to kill off the revolution. They, in the process, conceived of what they were doing as a revolution.
Hmm.
This is a revolution. Two concepts emerged. One was revolution. The other one was the concept of we the nation, bi milliyun. They referred to themselves as milliyun. First, they called themselves mujahid. Mujahid is the Islamic term for the crusader. Okay, the
Crusader. Okay.
crusaders against the forces of injustice. But then gradually the term Melliyun and became a reference to the multitude of those who took part in the civil war
I see.
in places. And as such, you would see that the concept of the Enqilab settles. In 1910, when Edward Granville Brown, the British, the English Orientalist and scholar, these days Orientalism is a dirty word, but in this case it's different. Uh, he was the great supporter of the Constitutional Revolution,
Hmm.
basically. He left everything out and became a great devotee and the supporter of Constitutional Revolution. In 1910, he produced, that is just after the end of the 1909 Civil War, he produced a book called The Persian Revolution in English. He called it, the title is The Persian Revolution, and on it he embossed it in Persian on the original edition. Embossed in Persian, پاینده باد مشروطه ایران. Long live the Iranian constitution. So that how the concept of the revolution in English and the concept of mashrute in Persian were intertwined. You would
Hmm.
find this in many of the
That
literature
is
of the period.
interesting. That's very interesting.
Yes.
I want to make just a comment, just my perception. I was reading your book since you mentioned Edward Brown, um, and I wrote the page numbers here because it was so intriguing to me. In pages 337 and 338 of your book, you talk about they called the Constitution fundamental law. Okay,
Yes.
but then immediately they do something. Now, I've read many dozens of books about America's founding years. I'm very familiar with that, and that's been a passion of mine. But then they immediately come up with something else called the supplement to the fundamental law. Again,
Yes.
I don't want to. I'm not opening a full discussion on this, but as an American, as someone who's grown up here, as a former attorney, reading this, it almost sounded like, okay, this is the Constitution. And immediately after, they come out with something like the Bill of Rights. You know what I mean? It's not exactly apples to apples to our Constitution of Bill of Rights.
No, it's not, as a matter of fact. You're absolutely right. Let me
Yeah,
explain this. First of all, they didn't call it constitution, or in French, because that was a more familiar
yeah.
language, constitution. They were afraid of that
Hmm.
because we haven't talked about the religious conservatism.
Yes,
Beside the
yes.
royalists, the religious conservatives would say, you are infidels. You are just following Europeans. This is not the way of us, the Muslims. You would like to bring about a regime called constitution. What is constitution? This is kufr.
Hmm.
This is this
Does
is
kofr mean sin?
sin or infidel. They
Okay, okay, yeah, yeah.
or what's the word for it? Not infidel. The word for it is uh, the
Sect.
profane. Yes.
Okay,
So
profane. Okay.
Pro- So leave it aside. This is for the Europeans. This is for the non-Muslims. This is not for us. They changed that to the idea of fundamental law. No, we are not conducting with constitution. We are creating the fundamental law, and we are not going to bother you, the Sharia people. You keep your Sharia.
That means
We want to
clergy and
clergy, the
their
mullahs.
religious law, the
Yes,
mullahs.
yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay.
And some of them were supporters of the Constitution Revolution. A few of them were, but majority of them were very, very skeptical about it.
Mhm.
And in due course were against it. So they were saying, okay, no, no, this is not the kind. We are not bringing the European model. We are creating our own model called fundamental law, in which we are trying to restrain the excesses of the political system. Not has nothing to do with religion. We don't have anything against religion. We are not infidels. So
Hmm.
that's one thing. And the second thing, in answer to your point, yes, that shows that the very idea of creating a constitution went through a process. It was
Yeah.
not as the first day they would sit there and say, okay, then now we have a constitution. It came about gradually.
There
They
was
first,
deliberation.
was it?
There was deliberation on this extensive.
Deliberation.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you have the American model that had was very much in their mind, we are going to create a constitution. For the Iranians, it took time to learn what does that
Yeah.
mean.
That's
And then the
fascinating.
supplement came about when more members joined the parliament. Because, I mean, just imagine in 1906, when the parliament was first constituted, there were only the members from the Tehran constituency,
Yeah.
from the representatives from, not from the biggest city, which was Tabriz, not from Isfahan, not from Mashhad, not from other cities. It took a while before these people could join, and there was no election. These were the first constitution. The representatives were elected from six classes, pretty much like the French model, the
Yeah. Yeah.
very, very beginning of the French model, that you had representatives from various classes. There were six classes:
Yeah.
the princes, the religious leadership, the khans, or being the landowning classes, the merchants, and the guilds, and the divan, the administration.
Mhm.
So the six classes that took part. So coming representatives from the provinces took time before they would arrive, and the constitution and the parliament became a bigger, more representative group of people. And then they say, oh, yeah, look at it. What you've put together as the constitution, as the fundamental law, is weak because it does not answer many of the questions. And then ideas came through and supplement, which is far more important than the constitution itself.
Yeah.
The supplement to the Constitution is far more
Just
important.
like our Bill
The
of Rights, we talk about the First
Bill of
Amendment
Rights,
rights.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
because that again shows that there was a process, of which probably some of the most important is equality before the law.
Hmm.
You see, distinction of a secular law from the religious law. The idea that minorities have the equal rights to the majority as far as the law is concerned. So this kind of a gradation of the society that you had under the Sharia, that Muslims are the superior or the advantage part of the society and the rest are the second class citizens, that was disappeared. And then, of course, the idea that the government requires a certain institution, as I pointed out, the question of the differentiation between the three branches of the government, these are all comes through the supplemental law of the country.
So you actually do in your book refer to it as checks and balances. And also the thing that as I was reading, I don't know whether or not they use these terms specifically, but they were essentially getting the power of the Shah and creating institutionalized power centers that were separate
Yes,
from each other. They were
yes,
instead of personalizing the government, they were
yes.
creating institutions around the
Institutions,
government. Yes, which makes
yes.
sense. I
And of
want to
course, let me
go ahead.
just very briefly, they managed to, as a matter of fact, create an executive power which was arrogated to the ruler. Okay, you are in charge of the executive power, as it is in the United States with the president of the of the government vis-a-vis the parliament, the Congress.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the legislative is the majlis or
Yes,
the parliament. The third one, the judiciary, they didn't dare to elaborate. They just talked about it, but they didn't dare to elaborate. Why? Because they were so afraid of the religious leadership, because they were so afraid that they were going to be denounced and they were denounced by the religious leadership because they were considered as, you are infidels. You're no longer Muslims. They were very afraid of that. And
because you're
therefore,
not adhering to Sharia law and these
yeah.
laws. Okay,
So
so
judiciary remained an enigma that
yes,
later on had its own implications for
yeah,
what happened in the post-revolutionary
that
times.
vagueness of what judiciary is
Yes,
all about probably undermined Iran's democratic movement in the 20th century.
yes, yes.
Now let's. There are. I'm contemplating how to proceed with the next question, Doctor Amanat, and I'm saying this openly for our audience so they know that this is a big question to come. You've mentioned Sharia. We've talked about the clergy so much, the mullahs. Um, the mullahs play a huge part, both good and bad, in this constitutional revolution that is so seminal to Iran's history. Um, can you just encapsulate that? What do they mean? The reason I say sort of briefly or encapsulated because I want to use that as a springboard, Dr. Amanat,
To
to
move
go
on.
to 1979, and that's
Yes,
in many
yes,
ways it comes back in a different form, and many of the problems
yes,
are not
yes,
resolved. So, what
yes,
role
yes,
did the clergy play? What were their gripes? What were the issues that remain unresolved for the
yes,
clergy?
yes, yes. For one thing, one should remember, like any other society, like any other establishment, there is a gradation. There is you don't have all uh, clergy
Yeah.
in one mind or one level. You see, the Shi'i clergy also were of
There's a
various
hierarchy.
layers.
Yeah, a
Yes, yeah.
hierarchy, and the
The
Catholicism is sort of
Yeah, that's
similar.
right. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
except for the fact that Shiism is far more anarchic than the
anarchic. Wow.
yes, anarchic,
Yeah,
because that kind of a power, even of the mujtahids, are not recognized as total and absolute. A mujtahid could be wrong. I mean, there is no institutional system that put a cardinal above a bishop. Okay,
Oh, in
there
Shiaism,
has no such a thing.
and is what is a Mujtahid? Is he like, does he have like an equivalent of a
Mujtahid is a
PhD
doctor
or
of
something?
law.
Doctor of law.
He's a
Okay, I
doctor
see.
of law.
Okay,
And the doctor of law, a doctor of jurisprudence.
yeah,
And the doctor of jurisprudence, even the definition of that, even the assumption of the idea that I'm a mujtahid is all questionable. There is nowhere that gives you a degree to say that you are a
there's
mujtahid.
there's no
Okay.
certificate.
No, there is no license, there's no PhD, there is nothing
Yeah,
like that. Madrasa system in Shiism, and that's one of the beauties of it, didn't have any of that. I mean, so even if you would consider yourself as a mujtahid because you spent 7 years in the madrasa or you've studied with so and so, somebody else could come along and say, okay, then you have all of that. I don't care because you don't, it does not apply to, there is no force behind it.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
There is a force of the Sharia, but there's not a force of an institution behind you.
yeah, yeah,
So the lower echelons of the religious establishment were far more pro-constitutional than the upper echelons. And they were more influenced by ideas of heterodoxy, such as the Babis. Babis did not disappear entirely.
yeah.
Babis remained and transformed into this lower echelons among the clergy that came and as a matter of fact, welcomed the constitutional revolution. So in many of the comments of the period, you would see that kind of a contention between the upper echelons and the lower echelons of the clergy. I mention this in order to point out that the approach or the um, uh, uh, the way that the religious establishment looked upon constitutionalism was different from one class to the next, from one group to the next, from
So
one person
the
even to the
clergy,
next.
the mullahs, were not a monolith. They really had different.
Never.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
you
yeah.
defined it very well.
Okay,
It's not like the Catholic Church.
okay,
It's not. It's not a system that would dominate the entire Sharia or the interpretation of the Sharia. So it was easier for many in the lower echelons. What happened to it afterwards? Since your question actually implied that once the constitutional revolution and the early Pahlavi era, that is between 1911 to 1920s and 30s, you see that many of the members, younger members of the clergy, abandoned the clerical education and the clerical garb, for that matter,
oh
and
wow.
moved and became more secular, as the term was for it. They became fokoli, meaning that they became tie wearing or hat wearing, the cap wearing, referred to as the mukalla, and came to the service of the Pahlavi state or to the service of the later constitutional period. Many of the judges in the courts, many of the people in the government, if you look at their background, many people in the public education background, if you look at them, they're all coming from the madrasa. So there was a massive exodus from the madrasa into secular environment. So the madrasa, as
That
a
is
result of that,
fascinating.
was impoverished. They did not
Oh
have as
wow.
much of the great as of a great diversity and a great variety as they had in before the constitutional period or before the Pahlavi period. So when we come to the question of what happened in the process, I would explain further. Is that
Okay.
where you would like to go?
Yeah, yeah.
You
I
want
like
there's a
what I want to know. I have a question about whether or not the constitutional revolution was betrayed, ultimately betrayed. by foreigners or by
Mhm.
Iranians or by the clergy. Um, I think clergy have much to do with it. Is that
Yes.
something you wish to
Yes, of course.
address?
Of
Yeah.
course. If there were three major to the process of constitutionalism and constitutional development, which was quite, if you look at it, defenseless. It did not have an army.
Hmm.
It did not have, except for the popular support. There was nothing really behind it. The 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 monarchy had still had the force, the weapon, and the military force behind it.
And they also
The
had the
cle-
Russians and at times the
yeah, of
British
course,
behind
yes,
them.
and the British
Yeah.
behind them,
Yeah.
and the clergy had the Sharia, so they had denounced you, and they can all do all kinds of things that would intimidate you. Third, and perhaps the most important, was the presence of European powers, basically the Russians and the British. And the fact that throughout the course of the 19th century, these two powers dealt with Iran as a middle ground, referred to as a buffer state, meaning
Buffer
a
state.
buffer between the two empires,
Hmm.
the Czarist Russian Empire in the north and the British Empire in the Indian subcontinent uh, and in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
So
And then
Iran
back
was in the
then,
middle.
for our audience, there was no Pakistan. So
No.
Hindustan, India
Yes.
literally bordered Iran.
Yes, it's a colony of the
Yeah,
British Empire.
exactly.
Okay. So, as such, Iran was felt somewhat as a buffer zone in the middle. When the constitution came about, for reasons entirely independent from the constitution, the British and the Russians came to an agreement that is referred to as the 1907 agreement of dividing Iran into two zones of influence. They never called it any kind of occupation or political control, zones of influence. What is the zone? Constitutionalists immediately ask, what is this? First of all, it was an open secret. They called it a secret agreement. There was nothing secret about it. There
So
was
wait,
a,
wait. This is an agreement between two countries about Iran without Iran's
yeah, and to
just involvement.
divide it into those two zones of influence. The British in the south, the Russians in the north, much greater
Yeah.
region under in their zone. Why they created the zones of influence? Why they decided to come to an agreement rather than a buffer state? That was the idea of the 19th century of
Yeah. Yeah.
rivalry between the two powers. That was the emergence of Imperial Germany and the fear of Imperial Germany in Europe that first created an entente between the French and the British, and then an agreement with the
Russians.
Tsarist Russia
Yeah.
to create a kind of a alliance against the rise of against the rise of Imperial Germany.
So we're talking
Why
about
they
the
were
Second
afraid of?
Reich. This is not the Third Reich yet.
No, no,
This
there's
is the
nothing to do
Second
with it.
Reich, the
This
Kaiser,
is
and
the
all of that. Yeah.
yes, Bismarck onwards. Okay,
Bismarck onwards.
when
Yes.
when the when there was the unification of Germany, the
In
Imperial Germany, as a
1871.
result,
Yes.
yes, emerged, and then became a great power, probably the greatest power of its own time, like the United States in today's. It
Yeah.
became a superpower, and therefore the other imperial powers of the time became very worried. And you remember that the 19th century is all about these great powers and the way that these great powers tend to define the world or divide the world between them. So that's why the zones of influence emerged in Iran. Iranians said, what has this to do with us? Why? We have nothing to do with you or with the Germans. They said, well, don't worry about it. This is our zones of influence. We are not interfering in anything concerning you, which was a huge lie.
We're
Because
dividing
what
up your country, but don't worry about it. You're not
was that?
We're dividing up your country into different
Yes,
zones, but don't
yes.
worry about it.
Zones. Yeah,
Yeah.
don't worry about it. This is not your business. And And then in practice, it became from day one, it became apparent that particularly with the Russians in the north, that this is our zone of influence. So we are sending armies out, we are controlling your cities, we are controlling whatever you're going to say or you do in this area. And then gradually became an extremely offensive, extremely oppressive force against constitutionalism. So by
Wow.
1911, you would see that much of the north was occupied, and they were particularly very angry, from Tsar Nicholas II down. They were angry with Iranians because the constitutionalism managed in 1909 to win the civil war and to expel Muhammad, Muhammad Ali Shah from Tehran because he was a pro-Russian, sent him to exile and bring his young son Ahmad Shah, who was a boy of 10, into power, a minor, into power.
And the
And
Russians were angry. How dare
were
you
extremely
defy
angry.
us?
Yes.
And how dare you get rid of a leader,
And
a Shah that we're supporting? I see.
And it was not just an anger, it was a fear, it was a threat. Why Iran, a weak country in the southern borders of Russia, which was nothing in terms of the population or economic power compared to Russian Empire, which was the biggest imperial power, biggest military power in Europe. Why? Because Iran was adjacent to the Caucasus, and Caucasus was the hotbed of revolutionary ideas against the Tsars.
Yeah.
All of
Um,
that happened with the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, where all happened first in Baku, in Tbilisi,
yeah.
in the centers in the Caucasus, and they were in very close cooperation with the constitutionalists in Azerbaijan.
So
So
the
as a result of
Caucasus are a mountain range. I want to set this up for our audience. The Caucasus are a mountain range between modern day Iran and Russia to the north. And in
that's
your
right.
book, you have many examples of pamphlets and newspapers that are being written in Baku, in Tbilisi, modern day,
Yes.
and in Yerevan, which is Armenia, and are being sent to Iran and are being sent up north to Russia. So this is what's got the czar all
Worried.
distressed.
Yes, and angered with
Ah,
the Iranians. So, in effect, they said, okay, we should put an end to this whole business of constitutionalism. In Tabriz, in particular, when in the Christmas Eve of 1911, just remember the coincidence. The Christmas Eve of 1911 corresponded to Ashura of Muharram of that year.
which is
In the
the anniversary, lunar calendar anniversary of martyrdom of the third Shia Imam. And the reason I belabor that point is because
Yes.
this becomes a repeating revolutionary inspiration that day, even in 1979.
Yeah, and
Ashura.
the most
Yeah.
sacred day in the in the Shi'i calendar, in the Iranian calendar,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
up to now, it
Even up to
is.
now.
So on that day, the Russians who occupied Tabriz and occupied all of the Azerbaijan and further north, the entire northern Iran, they uh, picked up a group of, I think, 10 or 12 constitutionalists, including some of the clergy constitutionalists that nobody would have dared to touch them, and hang them
Hmm.
on that day that was correspondent with the Ashura and the Christmas of that year,
Wow.
only to give a lesson to the Iranians that they cannot go against the wishes of what they perceive to be against the wishes of the Russian Empire. Iranians did not have that. Iranians did not want to go against the Russians. They wanted to have for their own country a constitutional regime.
Yeah.
But as far as the imperial powers, if you are asking me the question, what was the third and perhaps the most important opponent of the constitutionalism? That was the two foreign powers.
Two foreign
And
powers. Yeah.
the foreign powers. And if we would look at the consequence of that, that the story did not end in end of 1911, beginning of 1912. But throughout the course of the First World War, Iran suffered as a result of European intervention. The Russians from north, the British from the south, the Ottomans from the west. Ottomans were supported by the Germans.
Yeah, yeah.
Basically, Iranians got it worse from all sides.
Aisle size. I want to make
And
a point here about the Ottomans and the Russians. You said that the Russians feared Iran. You talked about the reasons why. Another point is something you said earlier. Just before around this time, Russia had experienced its own major revolution in 1905. Was it 1905 or 1906?
exactly, 1905.
1905, which almost it was like a dress rehearsal for the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in
Yes,
Russia.
yes.
So they feared a revolution there south, and also the Ottomans were going through their huge changes and revolutions. So they also, neither of these big empires to Iran's west and north wanted a revolution next door to them. They didn't
No.
want their own people inspired. Now, let me.
Which is, in a sense, you can see that Abdul Hamid, the last powerful sultan of the Ottoman Empire,
Mhm.
was extremely worried about the course of the Constitutional Revolution before 1908, when he eventually collapsed and the CUP came to power. So you see that their presence, the Iranian presence, was very important for both parties.
Yeah. Um, so, Dr. Amanat, there are well, there are many, but two themes of the constitutional revolution continue forward all the way through to the 1970s. One could say they continue to now. But one is foreign intervention, interference, and times outright just invasion. And the other one, constitutionalism, what sort of constitution we should have. Even from the many interviews and books I've read, having some sort of real constitution, not just on paper, and implementing it continues through the 50s, 60s, 70s in Iran. Now,
Yes.
this is so I say this to set up this question. You explained to us beautifully how the constitutional revolution, it really started as a reformation, and I shared the example that it was not like the French Revolution. It was more like
Yes.
what Edmund Burke of Britain
Yes.
would have liked to see, reform the system, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yet,
Precisely.
yet,
Yes.
yet, when it gets to the 1970s, 1978, I'll even be more precise, and I'm getting all this from your book. By 1978, mid 1978, the mullahs, the clergy, are not looking at reformation. Something there really looks at a just a full on revolution, regime change, changing everything, sort of
Ideological and militant.
exactly change everything. What snaps? What's the difference?
Well, precisely. What happened is that you should bear in mind that between the 1920s, that is right, rather even 1910, end of the Constitutional Revolution, because the clergy, majority of the upper echelons of the clergy supported the royalists, they were basically uh, put aside. They were no longer became part of the constitutional process or what was left of the constitutional
Oh,
process. During the Pahlavi era, from the very beginning, they were even further isolated. So the story of the clerical establishment in Iran from the 1920s up to 1970s is isolation. That is, they were forced back into the
this
madrasas.
is so counterintuitive, Dr. Amana. You say that their story of the upper echelon, the really learned, mullahs or ayatollahs,
Yes. Yes.
is really isolation. Yet, come
Yes.
1978, they're front and
Yes.
center, and there's Ayatollah
They
Khomeini.
reacted to that isolation. Isolation in the sense that they were no longer considered as part of the progressive system. They were sent back to the madrasas. They
Oh,
sulked and they became more and more angry with secular uh, regime, with the secular mode that tend to dominate the society. So what you would see during the Pahlavi era is this kind of secularism. And that was against the kind of a Sharia model that they had in mind. This alienation became more and more. I mean, the life of Khomeini himself is a very good example of it. He was born in 1900. During the post-constitutional period, he was a teenager. He was in his teens. Then gradually he witnessed the early Pahlavi era, and he saw how society has changed, became much more secular, how religion or their interpretation of religion was basically left aside, isolated, and they are no more relevant into the society in which in the past had great respect, had great reverence for them in the past, no longer. So
this is
people,
amazing. So I'd never thought of it this way. So in a way, where I'm sorry, I interject because
yes, yes, by all
I'm
means,
trying to
yes,
repeat to paraphrase what you've said to make sure I'm sort of walking along this path with you. So in a way where they had participation and a say, whether good or bad, that's irrelevant, but they had some sort of participation in the
yes,
constitutional revolution.
yes,
Post that, they were just completely shoved aside.
left aside,
Yeah,
yes,
and for our audience, based on your book and many others and conversations I've had in the past with scholars, uh, for Iran's independence vis-a-vis Russia, the clergy did participated in some of the battles between Imperial Iran and Imperial Russia. So it's not like the clergy were always just sitting in their seminaries praying.
yes. No, there were to some extent at least certain sectors of that clerical society were very much involved.
Yeah, yeah,
And but by the Pahlavi era, they were no longer viewed as that kind of a revered
yeah,
authority that they used to be in the past,
yeah,
authorities
yeah,
that they used to be in the past. So what happened to them gradually and and also at the same time, what I mentioned earlier on, they they
mm,
were weakened because of the exodus of the younger generation of many among the clergy into the secular society. And as the judiciary grew under the Pahlavi, their irrelevance became more evident. There was no more religious courts. There were no more religious law. It was all secular law that was legislated by the Pahlavi state. There
uh,
was a there was Have you seen the Ministry of Justice in Tehran? This
no,
huge
I have
building.
not.
You have
Yeah,
it. This is a huge building. It's a kind of it's an embodiment of this secular model that emerged in the 1920s and 30s, and at the
and you say the
expense.
huge building in Tehran, but sort of the judiciary was not just for big cities. Now also in smaller towns,
Yes,
the clergy are also irrelevant now because they're not
became
settling
more
this.
relevant because modern law that emerged, the modern civil law, the criminal law, and the financial, or rather the administrative law that was created, all was against the presence of the Sharia in the system. And with it, the religious establishment has lost its power. What instead it tried to gain, it, as I've argued in many times, including in in Iran book, was not to to modernize itself, to turn itself into legal modern in the American model,
Yeah.
that you would see that the legal establishment would emerge, which is a very powerful one, or
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
least it used to be powerful up to very recently. But the judiciary, okay, is a very important part of the American system.
Yeah.
In the Iranian system, they did not strive in that direction. So they did not modernize the Sharia. They did not try to answer many of the questions, arcane questions of the past. Human rights, position of women, position of the minorities, position of slavery in the society. These are all remained unresolved. And they insisted back into their arcane system. Instead, they
Hmm.
bypassed the entire process of relevance to the society by becoming politically militant. So what happened to them? That the mullahs that were always very conservative, that always pro-establishment, that there was always pro-monarchy, they turned into a revolutionary force that was against the monarchy, that was against secularism, that wanted to create an ideological political Islam. That's what they called it. They openly called it political ideology, political Islam. What was that political Islam meant? Militancy. We want to transform the society. To
Wow.
what? To our image. What was your image? Which was a haphazard idea of concepts that they picked up here and there, partly from the left, partly from Arab nationalism, partly from the rereading of the history of Shiism in a very kind of a revolutionary fashion. And all of them, bits and pieces, were put together in order to create what is today's ideology of the Islamic Revolution. That's what it is.
Um.
So in which you would see that there is a desire, a very strong anti-Westernism, very strong sense of a secular model that existed in the Pahlavi period, which was not unblemished. It was lots of things wrong with it,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but they went completely against it and want to create a
Yeah.
different society in their own image, which is a very convoluted image in a
Yeah.
sense.
Um. So, and you answered the question because as I was reading your book and it's even though you have chapters, it's not like history ends in one chapter and it's a whole new set of things. No, it's a
But
continuation
historians
to
have to.
it.
They
Yeah,
have no
exactly.
choice.
Well, what I'm saying is that it's a continuation, but you have two chapters. One is on the Constitutional Revolution, the other one is on the 1979 Revolution. When I started reading the chapter on the 1979 Revolution, hence my question, which you answered, is that it felt different. It felt that revolution and regime change, ideological, this cataclysm was there fairly rapidly in the process of the 1978 months preceding the 1979 revolution. Now, do you think now in Iran, this is not history anymore, but we're drawing lessons from history, Dr. Amanat. Do you think now in Iran conditions exist that are similar to the years leading up to the constitutional revolution, or conditions exist that are similar to the years leading up to the 1979 revolution? I'm asking you a very difficult question. I
Yes, yes.
appreciate that.
This is a loaded question,
Yeah.
and I would try to answer you. For one thing, revolutions are not predictable. All those historians who
Are
come and tell
not
you
predictable.
are not predictable.
Are not
So we
predictable.
don't know. We don't know whether it's going to happen. Once it happens, the historians go about and say, "Ah, yes, here we are. These are the roots and reasons for the revolution." But if it does not happen, there's no guarantee that it would happen. And people who are looking at the watches and think that Iran is going to be a regime change and there's things are going to change overnight because there was an assault from an outside power, or
Yeah.
because this regime has become so unpopular. It's all true. It's
Yeah,
very
it's all
extremely
true.
unpopular. And this power base is reduced and reduced to a very, very small monopolist power. There
This
is
all
what is,
sounds like the foundation for a revolution, Dr. Amanat.
yes, well, once it happens, we might say, yeah, just look at it. The past two days, uh, 30 of the upper echelons of the Revolutionary Guards and their associates were destroyed, were
Dismissed.
executed, executed by
Oh,
the
executed. Oh, wow.
Israelis, who bombed them and destroyed them.
Yeah, yeah. Killed
Or
by
if you
the.
look at it, the top echelon,
Hmm.
okay. So this is a regime which doesn't have that top right now. What's
Hmm.
going to happen? Or is it going to recreate another top? I don't know. Whether the real the upper echelon that is going to emerge eventually is going to be the same as the old one, or they are afraid that next day they may be in their bedrooms and a missile would come through and destroy them. We don't know. Is it
But
going to change their behavior? We don't know.
we don't know. Do you? Okay. Let me ask the question again. Then, do you think any of the conditions that existed in 1905 or 1979, or let's say 1904 and 1978, exist in Iran now?
Yes, in terms of discontent, yes. There's enormous amount of discontent. Perhaps 80, 90, it's very difficult. I'm a historian. I'm sitting here in Connecticut. I don't know what's the percentage.
Yes. Yes.
But a
Yes.
real, but from what I read and from what I know, it seems to me that the majority of the Iranian population are not for the regime. They are against the Iranian regime. They cannot wait to see it gone. But
Hmm.
that's one thing, and whether it's going to go eventually is another thing. So there is a discontent, political downturn, I'm sorry, economic downturn, because Iran is in a very dire situation as a result of sanctions, as a result of corruption and incompetence of this regime
Yep.
that is in power. Corruption and incompetence, both of them. And the third factor, oppression, the degree of oppression that you see in the Iranian society, uh, that every voice of dissent has been suppressed, has been sent into prison, has been intimidated by the Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
And finally, its power has been much more, the power base has been gradually reduced into a monopoly
Yeah.
that it's very small, probably 10% of the population,
Even the
if
masses that
that.
supported Mr. Khomeini in the
Oh,
1980s,
that disappeared
they have
decades
disappeared.
ago.
Yeah.
And let me tell you this one more thing quickly,
Please.
and that is that their attempt to Islamicize the Iranian society by and large failed. Not that it entirely
Yeah.
failed. Yeah, that obviously they had all the equipments of power in their hands. They had the propaganda, they had the public education, they had the resources, economic resources, all the oil revenue, everything in their hands. So they had to be able to change the Iranian society, but that is largely failed. As for instance, the events of 3 years ago during the Zan Zendegi
Massa
Azadi
Amini protests. Yeah.
Mahsa Amini clearly showed that they don't have the younger generations. The younger generations moved away from them, and for very good reason. This is a system that's not going to answer the question of the youth,
Yeah.
question of the ordinary people.
Neither their aspirations for the future and their ideological beliefs, nor their immediate material needs. I want to make a comment. Then I want to make a provisional prediction, and I'll share that with you, and you tell me whether or not my analysis on that is correct. One, you said that the this regime that calls itself the Islamic regime failed to really Islamicize Iran in the way they wanted. It's backfired. More Iranians are secular now, and this is something you can read about even in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. You don't need to be an Iran expert to figure that out. But in your book, you bring up something that's actually really delicious. I read it in several passages. I don't have the book pages in front of me, and in a way, you say that in Iran, Islam took its own shape. In some way, I'm not using the correct words because these are not the words you use. It almost sounds like Iranis never became those good Muslims, you know. And it's not just the Shia advent of like, making Iran a Shia country in the Safavids. Even going back before that, Iran just
Yes.
never became a good Muslim country in that
Well,
sense.
for very good reason. First of all, their language is different. They
Yeah,
were not, I mean, since the 7th century, they did not adopt Arabic. There was all the pressure on them, but they never accepted this. They adhere to their own language, Persian, which is the language of today's Iran. They have their own calendar. They have their own identity. They have their own way of looking at the past and their culture. Not perfect, but
yeah,
it's
yeah,
their own. This is something that is the outcome of centuries.
yeah.
That is,
Which is interesting because in some ways the Ottomans, who were not indigenous to the Anatolian peninsula, they came in. I mean, later Ottomans become much larger than just Turkic people, but they become in some ways better Muslims than the Persians, than the Iranians.
oh yes, or for that matter, the Egyptians or
Yeah,
the whole of the
that's really
region
interesting.
that today is considered as the Arab world. That's a
Yeah,
very different world from Iran.
yeah,
Even if you look at Afghanistan, which you would have expected that would have a far greater shared cultural heritage with Iran, you would see a very different society, of which the Taliban is one manifestations of it. Of
yeah,
course, you would see also in Afghanistan a great deal of a dissent against that system. It's
yeah,
very clear. Urban, particularly population,
yeah,
is completely against it. So, in effect, you would see that in the Iranian case, you have a special, they, as I said, sometimes as a kind of a, jokingly, that Iran, that the revolution of 1979, the Islamic revolution, was in a sense to convert Iranians to Islam. Yeah. but 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 it certain respect it failed because of the precisely your point. Not that Iranians would not consider themselves Muslims. They
yeah,
consider themselves great Muslims.
yeah,
But their view of the world is different. There is an element of nationalism, not in only in modern sense, but in pre-modern sense, that persisted, evolved over the course of time. I mean, Iranians had never forgotten that they have Shahnameh.
yeah.
They had never
Which
forgotten.
which creates a sense of distinction from, let's say, people to the east, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and a distinction to the people to the west, Arabs and Turks, that we, for whatever reason, we're different and our practice of Islam is different. And I just chuckle because I go back to sort of what you were
And
saying, that
not,
they're not.
and let me just make this very clear. This is not a sense of a cultural superiority.
Yeah,
Sometimes Iranians unfortunately think that they are. It's not a question of cultural superiority, but it's
great
a
point.
question of difference.
Mhm.
This is how their past evolved over a thousand. Iranians had never forgotten, as just brief mention, Iran has never forgotten what is pre-Islamic past. If you open a medieval text of universal history of Iran, you would see that they always start with the Sassanians. That's
Yeah,
all they knew. They start creation of man. It starts with Shahnameh. You see, so they always had an idea of their own that this is a different kind of a system. This is a kind of a different kind of a concept of their society and culture.
yeah. I asked you whether or not you think the conditions that existed in 1905 before 1905, the early years of the Constitutional Revolution, and then let's say 1970 and 1979, the years relevant to the Islamic Revolution exists now. There's one thing, having read your book, as well as others, but particularly your book, because your book is so detailed about both periods. There's one thing that I noted. I came across so many different names as I was reading about the Constitutional Revolution, different potential leaders, the dispersed leadership that you and I discussed earlier, and then there's the 1979 revolution. Even though Mr. Khomeini comes on top, there are so many different leadership groups within Iran. Now, as I look at Iran today, and I don't follow Iran news all that much more than what I see on our TV, but as I look at it, I don't know whether or not that sort of multiplicity of different leadership groups exist in Iran. Hence, query whether or not a revolution can happen. Do you think
Yeah.
that's a valid point,
Well,
valid
it's
sort
a
of
very
analysis?
valid point. It's a
Yeah.
very, very valid point. The answer to that, from my perspective, is that if the Islamic Republic was unsuccessful in everything else and it remained incompetent and corrupt and oppressive, one thing it was good at, and that was eliminating any alternative. And that's
Wow.
what they did. They
Wow.
basically did not allow the emergence, which is what they share with the Pahlavi period,
Yeah.
that they did not allow any kind of an alternative to the
Wow.
regime in power. What happens is that today's Iran, I am much more, to shorten the answer to your question, I'm much more in favor of a moderate Islamic regime in power rather than a regime change, because that's a much more realistic assumption than a chaos that might emerge as a result.
Yeah.
I
You don't
think,
know.
I think if there would be a better understanding, first of all, with Mr. Khamenei and the guardianship of the jurist is going to be abandoned, perhaps a more balanced, a more realistic idea of government would emerge
Hopefully.
in persons even like Mr. Hassan Rouhani, former president. He was more or less middle of the road.
I thought he was a
Pezeshkian.
super hardliner, no?
No, he was not. No,
Oh,
it's
okay.
Raisi was.
I
Raisi
see.
was.
I see. I
But
apologize.
not,
Yes,
this
yes.
was before Raisi,
Yeah, yeah.
the one who has
Yeah.
actually made some noises
Mm-hmm.
in past few days. He made
Mr.
some,
Rouhani.
yes,
Yeah.
Rouhani, because he thinks that, and he's right, he's a clergy, he wears turban and
Yeah, yeah.
wears gown, and he behaves like a clergy. But deep down, he's much more of a moderate. He wants to allow a much more of a much more of a society, not democratic, but greater representation, a little bit of opening up, less isolation at the outside world. All the maladies, all the plagues that the Islamic Republic is suffering from, he probably would be a better choice. Or for that matter, the current president, Pezeshkian, might be able to create this,
So
an alternative.
in many ways, Mr. Pezeshkian or Mr. Rouhani or what
Whoever
you,
else, yeah, somebody
whoever
that
else
might
you're
emerge.
suggesting is that you're saying that the immediate path that may, in the long run, lead to Iran's, larger transformations and prosperity, the immediate path may make sense to be a reformation versus a bloody and revolution, whatever that means, or like,
Yes,
yeah, I see.
yes, I am in favor of it. I've been attacked because I've said so, but I think it's a far more realistic. Revolutions usually don't pay off.
Yeah,
Revolutions are usually getting to worse situations. And in the Iranian case, I think Iran would benefit, having created the delicate situation in which you have 92 million people in this land with limited resources, facing all kinds of problems, facing sanctions, facing environmental challenges, huge environmental challenges.
Yeah,
So you want a system that preserves some degree of normalcy and allow the society to gradually emerge towards a better future.
I hope so. And with respect to your comment about revolutions, I just want to add this. I haven't come across even one revolution that has actually succeeded, that has achieved its aims, that hasn't been betrayed somehow, all the aspirations and
Or
dreams.
being not non-violent.
Non-violent, yeah. And,
Yes,
and and for our European and American audience, I stress this for 2 points. One is, as you will know, particularly European writers highlight this, that our revolution here in the United States, the American Revolution, is not really a revolution in that sense. It was a war of independence. And
yes,
also, so that's not a revolution in that sense. The men who had power, they were not displaced. George
yes,
Washington's of the world continued to hold power.
yes,
Um, and the other revolution that Westerners are familiar with, which is I think it's the 1688 Glorious Revolution of
yes.
quote unquote glorious revolution of England, was not a revolution at all. It was a
Not
takeover.
at all.
It was
No,
a
no,
so my point is, your comments about revolution may not be a bad thing. I just want to highlight that revolutions just have not worked, and I've read a lot about
no,
revolutions.
no.
Yeah. So
Well,
well,
apparently, to my the only one that I found that apparently
uh-huh.
did not end in total disaster is Portuguese Revolution. That
Is that was that in the 1970s? Was
this
that what? Yeah,
1970s.
yeah.
That's
Oh,
right.
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not
That's
familiar with
about the
that.
only one
The only
that
one.
I could come across. Otherwise, you look at the rest of them across the board, East and West, South Asia, Southeast Asia, everywhere you look, Africa, whatever, they're all failures.
Yeah. Well, my hopes and best wishes
More,
for
more violence. They
more
all end
violence.
up in greater violence and
Yeah.
greater monopoly of power.
Yeah. Well, I hope my hopes and best wishes for the people of Iran that they have ordinary lives like you and I. They want to put their kids to school,
Yes, yes,
feed, buy a car, have a wedding. So hopefully they'll get to do that in a way that
yes,
doesn't create
yes.
violence as they change their form of government. Dr. Amana, thank you so much for educating me and our
Thank you very
audience.
much, Adel. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
Same here. I look forward to having you on our program again.